The Oakhaven River was not a collection of water. It was a violent, liquid contract between the sky and the soil, and today the sky was winning. Jane Ellingham stood on the crumbling embankment, the smell of damp silt and bruised reeds thick in the morning air, and watched the grey-brown surge with the eye of a mathematician. She did not gasp, she did not wring her hands. She stood with her spine as straight as a ledger line, observing the chaotic velocity of the current as it churned against the roots of the ancient willows. To any other observer, the river was a tragedy in motion. To Jane, it was a problem of physics, weight, and the unforgiving geometry of the bend. The small blue jacket bobbed in the center of the froth, a tiny, struggling anchor in the storm of the flood. Jane Ellingham calculated the distance from the shore, 40 feet, and the speed of the boy's descent against the fixed point of the jagged rocks downstream. She had exactly 90 seconds before the current would pull him into the narrows, where the water compressed and the force tripled. The teacher lost no time. She did not cry for help that would not arrive in time. She stepped out of her heavy wool cloak, shedding the weight of the sodden fabric with a series of efficient, practiced movements, and felt the bite of the April wind through her thin cotton bodice. The heavy wool cloak was not a piece of clothing. It was a discarded burden, a tactical sacrifice made in the name of buoyancy. Jane knew the river's temperament, as well as she knew the village school's accounts, meticulously, without sentiment, and with an awareness of every hidden debt. She moved 10 yards upstream of the boy's position to account for the lateral drift. The water, when she entered it, was a physical assault. It was the temperature of iron in winter, a shocking, air-stealing cold that threatened to seize her muscles before the first stroke was taken. She did not fight the river's center. She did not attempt to swim directly toward the child. She utilized a diagonal ferry angle. Her body tilted at 45 degrees to the flow, allowing the river's own momentum to carry her toward the middle, while she provided the forward thrust. Each breath was a measured, conscious act, taken only when her face was clear of the spray. The grit of the silt found its way into her eyes and mouth, but she remained focused on the blue jacket. She counted the strokes, 1, 2, 3, matching the rhythm to an internalized metronome, charting the seconds. The boy, Julian Vane, was a small, pale ghost in the water. He was no longer splashing. His energy had been spent fighting the inevitable, and now he was merely drifting, his lungs likely heavy with the very thing that was carrying him away. Jane Ellingham reached him just as the river began to narrow, the water beginning to roar with a new predatory intensity. She did not grab for his limbs, which would have put them both at risk of being dragged under. She waited for the crest of a surge, reached out with an arm that felt like leaden stone, and caught the collar of his coat. The weight was immense. Julian Vane was 7 or 8 years old, but in the grip of the current, he felt like 100 pounds of dead ballast. Jane tucked his head against her shoulder, keeping his face above the surface, and began the agonizing process of the return. This was the true labor. The river pulled at them with 1,000 invisible hands, dragging them toward the rocks. She did not panic. She did not let her posture collapse even under the surface. She sought the eddies, the small pockets of calm water behind submerged boulders, using them as stepping stones to gain inches against the flood. When her feet finally touched the mud of the bank, it was not the victory of a hero, but the conclusion of a successful audit. She dragged the boy's limp form onto the grass, her fingers trembling not from fear but from the limits of muscular endurance. Julian Vane lay silent, his skin the color of skimmed milk, his lips tinged with a delicate, terrifying blue. Jane did not weep over him. She did not pray aloud. She turned him onto his side, cleared the silt from his throat with a firm, clinical finger, and began the rhythmic compression of his chest. She worked with a steady, mechanical precision. The world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing and the resistance of the boy's ribs under her palms. After the 12th compression, the child shuddered. A violent, racking cough forced the river water from his lungs, followed by a thin, thready cry that was the most beautiful sound Jane had heard in 5 years. She did not hug him. She wrapped her arms around his shivering frame to share her remaining body heat, her eyes scanning the horizon for the nearest shelter. The iron gates of Aristhall Hall loomed through the grey sheets of rain like silent stone sentinels guarding a kingdom of isolation. Jane Ellingham walked toward them, her boots squelching in the mud, carrying the child with a grip that had moved beyond strength into the realm of pure, stubborn will. She was soaked to the bone, her hair a tangled mess of river weeds and dark brown locks, and her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Yet, as she approached the massive estate, she hardly appeared as a victim of the elements. She looked like an invading force. The Aristhall estate was a monument to order and ancestral pride, its stone walls thick with the history of the Vane family. Jane knew this house. She knew the way the gravel paths were raked to a precise grain, the way the servants moved with a hushed, terrified efficiency. She had refused to be a part of this house once, 5 years ago, when the offer of a coronet had been presented to her as if it were a charity. She had chosen the drafty schoolhouse and the ink-stained fingers of a teacher over the gilded cage of a duchess. Now, the river had brought her back to its doorstep, not as a suitor, but as a savior. She reached the back entrance, the heavy oak door that led to the kitchens, and did not knock. She kicked the base of the wood with her boot, a sharp, authoritative strike that echoed through the stone corridor beyond. When the door swung open, revealing a startled young scullery maid, Jane refused to wait for an invitation. She pushed past the girl, her presence a cold, wet disruption to the warmth of the hearth. "Procure blankets immediately," Jane commanded, her voice level and devoid of the tremors that racked her body. "Gather hot bricks wrapped in flannel, and find Mrs. Martha Gable now." The scullery maid gawked, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the dripping, formidable woman and the unconscious child in her arms. Who are you?" "You can't be in here. I am the woman currently keeping the heir to this estate from freezing to death," Jane Ellingham stated, her eyes flashing with a cold intellectual fire. "Move." The girl fled, her clogs clattering on the flagstones. Jane moved to the large wooden table in the center of the kitchen, clearing a space among the bowls of rising dough with one sweeping motion of her arm. She laid Julian Vane down, her fingers immediately checking the pulse at his throat. It was stronger now, a rhythmic thumping that spoke of a heart reclaiming its territory. Mrs. Martha Gable appeared moments later, her apron crisp and her face set in the habitual mask of a head housekeeper who had seen everything and approved of very little. She stopped short at the sight of the kitchen table, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the small, pale face of the boy. "Master Julian," Mrs. Martha Gable cried, her composure fracturing for a brief human second. "God in heaven, what has happened?" "The river happened," Jane replied, her tone cutting through the rising panic like a surgeon's blade. "He fell at the bend near the old bridge. I have cleared the water from his lungs, but his core temperature is dangerously low. I need the bricks I requested, and the London physician must be sent for, though I suspect he will be useless. Do you have dried feverfew and willow bark in the still room?" Mrs. Martha Gable looked at Jane Ellingham then, really looked at her. She saw the ruined dress, the blue-tinged skin, and the unwavering, straight spine of the woman standing over the boy. There was a flicker of recognition in the housekeeper's eyes, a memory of a girl who had once stood in a ballroom and told a duke that his pride was a poor substitute for a personality. "Miss Ellingham," Mrs. Martha Gable whispered, her voice thick with shock. "Is it truly you?" "My identity is a matter of secondary importance, Martha," Jane answered, using the woman's first name with the familiarity of their shared past. "The boy is the primary concern. Get the blankets. If we do not warm him slowly, his heart will fail." The kitchen became a hive of directed motion. The schoolmistress stood at the center of the chaos, the one fixed point in a turning world. She remained standing. She declined the tea offered by a trembling cook. She stripped the boy of his wet clothes, her movements efficient and respectful, and began wrapping him in the heated flannels brought by the maids. She checked the clock on the wall, noting the time of each intervention with the mental precision of a ledger entry. She was aware of the stares of the staff, the whispers that she was a ghost, a madwoman, or a miracle. She ignored them all. To be seen was not her goal, to be effective was her only ambition. She watched Julian's chest rise and fall, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder to monitor the tremors of his recovery. "The master," one of the footmen whispered near the doorway. "Someone has gone to the library to fetch his grace. He was out on the north pastures when it happened." Jane's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. Arthur Vane, the Duke of Aristhall. The man who had looked at her 5 years ago, and seen a difficult girl who didn't understand the honor of his hand. She had refused him not because she didn't feel the pull of his grey eyes, but because she knew that to marry him would be to lose the very competence that had just saved his son. He wanted a portrait. She was a master builder. She felt the shift in the air before she heard the footsteps. The room grew silent, the frantic energy of the servants evaporating into a heavy, expectant dread. The heavy thud of riding boots echoed in the hall, growing louder, more urgent. Jane held her position. She made no effort to smooth her hair or attempt to hide the mud on her face. She kept her gaze fixed on Julian Vane, her fingers counting the boy's shallow breaths. The door to the kitchen swung open with a violence that spoke of a nobleman accustomed to the world bending to his will. Arthur Vane stood in the threshold. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his face etched with the lines of a widower that had weathered a silent private war since the death of his wife. He was splattered with mud, his riding coat damp, and his eyes were wide with a terror that no amount of wealth could buy off. He failed to notice Jane initially. He saw only the small, bundled form on the table. He lunged forward, his breath catching in a jagged sob that he tried to stifle behind his teeth. "Julian," Arthur Vane choked out, his hand reaching for the boy's face with a desperation that made the servants look away. Is he breathing?" "He is breathing, Arthur," Jane assured him, her words quiet and steady, a tether of reality in his sea of panic. "His pulse is 64 beats per minute. His lungs are clear, though the risk of congestion remains high. Do not touch him yet. Your hands are too cold." The Duke froze, the sound of that voice, level, authoritative, and utterly unimpressed by his title, acted like a physical blow. He slowly lifted his head, his grey eyes meeting Jane's across the expanse of the flour-dusted table. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the hearth. Arthur Vane looked at the woman before him. The mud-stained, shivering, formidable woman who held his son's life in her steady hands, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Jane?" he breathed, the word a question, a plea, and a memory all at once. "You?" The formidable woman offered no smile. She skipped the customary curtsy. She simply adjusted the flannel wrap around the boy's neck and looked Arthur Vane in the eye. "The boy is alive," she declared, her delivery as firm as a foundation stone. "The rest is merely a matter of management." The kitchen table was not a piece of furniture. It was an altar of a private kingdom where social status had no currency. Arthur Vane, the master of the estate, remained frozen at the threshold of his own service entrance, his riding boots leaving dark, jagged smears of mud upon the scrubbed stone floor. He was an aristocrat owning 30,000 acres of prime English soil and commanded an army of tenants with a single lifting of his brow. Yet in this humid, candle-lit kitchen, he was utterly bankrupt of authority. The dampness of the spring rain clung to his heavy wool coat, smelling of horsehair and wet earth, but he did not seem to feel the chill that seeped into the marrow of the house. His entire existence had narrowed to the woman standing over his son, the woman whose image he had spent 5 years trying to burn out of his memory with the cold acid of aristocratic pride. Jane kept her eyes firmly averted from him. She ignored the shock radiating from him, like heat from a furnace, nor did she allow the sharp ache of the past to interfere with the steady, calculating rhythm of her hands. She was counting Julian Vane's pulse, her thumb pressed firmly against the delicate, translucent hollow of the boy's wrist, her eyes fixed on the ticking clock above the hearth. She was a master of the audit, and the only ledger that mattered now was the one written in the child's shallow, rattling breaths. Every second was a debt to be collected. Every heartbeat was a small, fragile victory against the river's attempt at foreclosure. To Jane, Julian was not a duke's heir or a symbol of a broken lineage. He was a biological system that required immediate, technical stabilization. She pressed her fingers against the boy's pale cheek, assessing the capillary return with the meticulous attention she gave to a column of figures. "Arthur," she said, her voice cutting through the humid, flower-scented air with the surgical precision of a sharpened quill. "I believe I instructed you not to touch him. Your hands are currently the temperature of the north pasture after a frost, and his heart cannot withstand a sudden shock of cold to the extremities. Stand by the fire. If you wish to be useful, remove that sodden coat before you begin to shiver and further agitate the air. We require a steady atmosphere, not the nervous tremors of a frightened father. The Duke stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, his breath coming in jagged, uneven gasps that mirrored Julian's own struggle. The servants, clustered in the shadows of the scullery, watched with wide, terrified eyes. They had never heard a human being speak to the noble lord in such a manner. Certainly not a woman who looked as though she had just been dragged from the silt-heavy bottom of the Oakhaven River. Jane was a ruin of wet cotton and tangled hair, her skin deathly pale under the flickering tallow light, yet she projected a sovereignty that made the Duke's ancient title seem like a triviality of birth. She was in her kingdom now, and her laws were the laws of physics and medicine. She remained perfectly still under his stare. She continued her work, wiping the last traces of river mud from Julian's collarbone with a fresh linen cloth. "Jane," Arthur whispered, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. It was the same voice that had once asked her to be his Duchess in a garden thick with the scent of midsummer roses. When she had said no, it had been a calculated refusal based on his inability to see her as anything more than a compliant addition to his estate. He had been a man of portraits and silhouettes, valuing aesthetics over substance. She was a woman of stewardship, demanding logic over tradition. Seeing her now, commanding his kitchen and holding his legacy in her mud-stained hands, was a reckoning he had never anticipated. He finally moved, shedding his riding coat. He let the expensive wool thud onto the floor, without a second thought for its value. He paid no attention to the grandeur of his house. He focused solely on Jane. 5 years had sharpened the angles of her face, and the ink-stained fingers of a schoolmistress had replaced the gloved hands of the debutante he had once courted. He noticed, with a sudden hollow realization, that she wore no rings. Her hands were bare, scarred by labor, and entirely uncompromising. "How?" Arthur managed to ask, his voice cracking as he watched her adjust a heated flannel around Julian's chest. "How did you find him? Why were you even at the river on such a wretched afternoon?" "I was at the river because the geometry of the bridge is fundamentally flawed. And I have been warning the parish council for months that the southern embankment is unstable," Jane replied, her fingers never ceasing their work as she massaged the boy's chilled limbs. She was not offering him a story of heroism. She was providing a technical audit of structural failures. "I found him because I heard the specific sound of a child who did not know that the Oakhaven current triples its velocity at the bend during the spring thaw. I used a diagonal ferry angle to reach him, a matter of utilizing the current's momentum rather than fighting it. The rest is irrelevant. Mrs. Gable, are the heated stones ready?" Mrs. Martha Gable stepped forward, her face a mask of professional resolve. She carried 2 large river stones wrapped in layers of thick, protective flannel. The housekeeper looked at the Duke, a brief, questioning glance, but Jane's voice intercepted the moment. The kitchen was entirely under her command. "You will place them at the boy's feet first, Mrs. Gable," Jane commanded, "not directly against the skin, between the layers of the blanket. We must draw the warmth upward toward the core without scalding the extremities, and prepare the dried feverfew and willow bark. The water he ingested was not clean. He will almost certainly have a fever by midnight, and I intend to have the remedy prepared before the first shiver begins." Jane reached for the heavy stone mortar and the polished wooden pestle, resting on the edge of the flour-dusted table. With rhythmic, measured strikes, she began to grind the dried leaves she had extracted from the deep pockets of her heavy wool cloak. The sharp, bitter scent of the herbs cut through the dampness of the room, providing a medicinal clarity that grounded the rising panic. She worked the pestle with a steady, punishing force, breaking down the fibers of the willow bark to release its essential compounds. Every crush of the stone was a testament to her meticulous preparedness. She manufactured his survival out of botanical chemistry, rigorous application, and unyielding will. The kitchen was filled with the rhythmic grinding, a sound that spoke of discipline rather than despair. Arthur Vane stepped forward, his paternal instinct warring with the sudden realization of his own domestic incompetence. "I will send for the carriage. We should move him to his rooms upstairs immediately. The nursery is prepared with the finest linens. This is a kitchen, Jane. It is no place for a recovery of this magnitude. This is the only room in this house with a constant source of heat and immediate access to boiling water," Jane countered, her eyes meeting his with a look that silenced his protest. The nursery is drafty, the corridors are cold, and moving him now would be an act of vanity, not medicine. He stays here, on this table, until I am satisfied that his blood has regained its proper temperature. Your son is not a duke in this moment. He is a biological system in crisis, and I am the only one here who understands the mechanics of his recovery. The titled aristocrat flinched as if she had struck him across the face. To be told that his son was a system was a profound insult to his aristocratic sensibilities, yet he realized that his status was a useless currency in the face of nature's indifference. He understood the value of a bloodline, but he did not understand the chemical value of the feverfew. He understood the prestige of the nursery, but he did not understand the physics of heat transfer. His wealth could not buy the boy's next breath. Only Jane's calculations could secure it. "You must follow her instructions," Arthur said, turning to the gathered servants, his voice defeated. "Everything Jane requires, she is to have immediately. In this room, her word is the final law." The household suddenly accelerated into a frantic but ordered pace. Jane Ellingham became the pivot point around which Aristhall Hall turned. She directed the footmen to move heavy flour bins to create a sheltered alcove around the table. She sent the scullery maid for specific herbs. The heated stones were placed with clinical precision at Julian's feet, and Jane watched the color begin to return to the boy's cheeks, a faint, ghostly pink. It was the quiet satisfaction of an architect seeing a foundation hold firm against a devastating storm. She adjusted the flannel once more, her movements measured by the ticking of the clock. Arthur stood by the hearth, the heat steaming the moisture from his clothes in white plumes, but he remained a ghost in his own home. He watched the woman he had once called difficult because she had dared to audit his private library and point out egregious errors in his Greek translations. He had thought her pride was a defect. Now, he saw that it was a fortress of survival. "You haven't changed, Jane," he said, the words heavy with a melancholy he could no longer suppress. "You still treat the world as if it were a problem to be solved with a ruler and a steady hand." "The world is a problem, Arthur," the teacher noted, her tone kept low. "It is a chaotic, poorly managed enterprise that thrives on ignorance. Most simply choose to ignore the structural failures until the roof collapses. I prefer to keep a meticulous inventory of the risks. It is the only reliable defense against ruin." She looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the hearth. "You sent me away 5 years ago because I told you that your estate was bleeding money through gross mismanagement. You told me then that a lady should not concern herself with ledgers and accounts. Look at your son, Arthur. He is the only ledger that matters now. If I had not spent the last 5 years learning the geography of that river and the properties of the herbs in this valley, he would be a body in the reeds, and you would be a duke with nothing but empty rooms to inherit. My competence is not an affront to your dignity. It is the very shield that protects it." The silence that followed was not a lack of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating moral weight that filled the kitchen. Arthur felt like a beggar at his own gate. She had not raised her voice. She had simply let the truth of her labor speak for itself. "The physician will arrive within the hour," Arthur said, seeking some small foothold in the conversation. "He will know the proper course of action for a drowning victim." "The county physician is a doctor treating every ailment with a bleed and a lecture on the ancient humors," Jane stated, devoid of emotion. "When he arrives, you will thank him, pay his fee, and then tell him to leave. I will be the one who manages the fever. Jane, you cannot simply dismiss a physician of his standing." "I can and I will," she interrupted, her voice gaining a new rhythmic intensity. "I saved him from the riverbank. I cleared the water from his lungs while you were still riding in the rain. I have stabilized his temperature. If you want Julian to see the sunrise, you will trust my technical knowledge over his social standing. A matter of action, Arthur, not of emotion." The Duke of Aristhall looked at the woman who had once refused him. For the first time in 5 long years, he did not see a woman who was difficult. He saw a woman essential to the world's functioning. The ledger of their lives was no longer in his hands. It was under the ink-stained fingers of Jane Ellingham, and she was the only one who knew how to balance the debt. The auditor sought no gratitude. She expected no praise. She simply adjusted her grip on the boy's hand and waited for the night to begin. The fire was not a source of comfort. It was a tactical necessity in the war against the damp that threatened to reclaim Julian Vane's lungs. Jane Ellingham sat in a straight-backed wooden chair by the hearth, her posture unyielding, even as the clock struck 3 in the morning. The kitchen of Aristhall Hall had settled into a heavy, expectant silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the oak logs and the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the boy on the table. Jane watched the orange light dance across the copper pots hanging from the rafters. Her mind moved with the precision of a master weaver through the fabric of the past 5 years. She refused to let her eyelids droop. She banished any wandering thoughts from entering the territory of self-pity. She maintained her vigil with the same intellectual rigor she applied to the village school's ledger. She was auditing every sound and shadow for signs of a failing recovery. The firelight triggered a memory she had kept locked behind the iron doors of her discipline. 5 years ago, the light had been different, the golden, honeyed glow of a summer sunset over the Aristhall gardens. She recalled the weight of the silk gown she had worn. It was a garment that felt like a decorative shackle. The scent of damask roses had been so thick it was suffocating. Arthur Vane had stood before her then, his silhouette imposing against the manicured hedges. He offered her his name and his estate, as if he were presenting a trophy to a deserving victor. He had looked at her not as a partner, but as a masterpiece to be acquired. He wanted a wife who would grace his table and mirror his prestige. He had not wanted the woman who spent the afternoon identifying structural rot in his east wing and insolvency in his tenant records. She remembered the way his brow furrowed when she told him no. It was a refusal he could not compute. In his world, a woman of her standing, penniless but well-bred, should have been grateful for the rescue he offered. He did not understand that Jane Ellingham did not require a rescue. She required a stewardship. She had looked into his grey eyes and seen a man who valued the facade of power more than the mechanics of it. He wanted a portrait. She was an architect. To marry him would have been to accept a life of gilded silence. In that life, her mind would be treated as an inconvenient curiosity rather than a formidable tool. She had chosen the cold, ink-stained reality of Oakhaven over the hollow warmth of his proposal. In the 5 years since, she had built a kingdom of her own out of scrap wood and shared knowledge. She felt zero regret over the refusal. As she watched the heated riverstones maintain their warmth against Julian's feet, she felt a grim satisfaction in the truth of her choice. Had she been the wife he sought, she would have been upstairs in the master bedroom now. She would have been weeping into a lace handkerchief, while a series of incompetent men bled her son to death. Instead, she was here in the heart of the house. She was manufacturing a recovery out of willow bark, dried feverfew, and common sense. The fire popped a sharp sound like a gavel hitting a bench. Jane adjusted the blanket over the boy's chest. She checked the clock. It was time for the next dose of the tincture. The silver tea tray appeared at the edge of her vision, just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the high kitchen windows. It was not carried by a maid or a footman. Arthur Vane, the wealthy peer, walked toward her with a slow, cautious gait. His hands gripped the edges of the tray with a precarious intensity. He looked older than he had 10 hours ago. The crisp lines of his aristocratic bearing had frayed. His cravat was discarded, his shirt was wrinkled, and his hair was a disordered map of the night's anxiety. He hardly resembled a figure of power. He appeared as a father that had finally realized his title offered no protection against the silence of a house without a heartbeat. The silver tea tray was not a symbol of service, it was a flag of surrender. He set it down on the corner of the table with a faint metallic clatter. His eyes darted immediately to Julian. The boy was asleep. His color was no longer a ghostly white, but a soft, living cream. The Duke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the river rescue, a long, shuddering exhale that made his shoulders slump. He posed no questions about whether the boy was better. He could see the state of the ledger for himself. Jane Ellingham had balanced the accounts of the night, and the boy was still in the black. "The household is awake, but I told them to stay back," Arthur said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that lacked its usual resonance. "Mrs. Gable is preparing the breakfast, though I suspect no one has the appetite for it. I brought this. The cook said you hadn't eaten since yesterday. I didn't know how you took your tea, so I brought everything." Jane looked at the tray. There was a pot of strong Assam, a bowl of sugar, a pitcher of cream, and a plate of buttered toast that looked cold. It was a clumsy, amateurish attempt at care. It was a domestic task he had clearly never performed in his life. The silver was slightly tarnished at the edges. Jane noted this with her usual clinical precision. It was an indication of the rot she had warned him about years ago. These were the small, creeping signs of a household managed by tradition rather than by active stewardship. "I take it black." "Arthur?" Jane replied. Her voice was steady and devoid of the fatigue that tugged at the corners of her eyes. "Sugar and cream are distractions for those who do not wish to the alveolity of the brew. Sit down. You are vibrating with exhaustion. The boy will sense your agitation if you hover over him like a spectre." The Duke did not argue. He pulled a chair from the shadows. The wood scraped harshly against the flagstones. He sat opposite her, looked at his son, then at Jane, and then at the stone mortar and pestle that sat like a weapon among the tea things. He looked at her ink-stained fingers and the mud that still dried in the folds of her skirt. He seemed to be seeing her for the first time. She was not a memory or a refusal, but a physical force of nature. She had anchored his world when the current tried to pull it under. "You were right, Jane," he said. The admission fell between them with the weight of a leaden debt. "About everything. 5 years ago, you told me that I was surrounding myself with ghosts and facades. I thought you were merely being difficult. I thought your intellect was a weapon you used to shield yourself from the vulnerability of being a woman. I see now that it was never a shield. It was a tool I was too arrogant to realize I needed." Jane expected no apology. She required no validation of his regret. She poured herself a cup of the black tea. The steam rose in a thin, vertical column that mirrored the straightness of her spine. She paused before drinking it. She watched the surface of the liquid. She observed the way it reflected the growing light from the window. "Your household has been in chaos for years, Arthur," Jane observed. Her tone was analytical rather than accusatory. "I have watched it from the village. I saw the way your tenant cottages fell into disrepair while you focused on the aesthetics of the main hall. I heard the accounts from the markets, the late payments, the confusion in the orders. You have lived in a world where you expected the machine to run itself because your name was on the deed. But machines require maintenance. Life requires active management. You treated your son's safety with the same negligence you treated your estate. You assumed the river would respect the Vane name. The river does not read the peerage." Arthur winced. His fingers tightened on the edge of the silver tray. "I thought the bridge was sound. I thought the groundskeepers were watching him. I have been absent, Jane. Since his mother died, I have found it easier to live in the library with my books. I preferred records of the past to the reality of the present. I made my life a facade because the truth of it was too heavy to carry alone. To carry it alone is a choice, not a necessity," Jane countered. "But you did not want a partner to help with the weight. You wanted an ornament to hide the cracks in the wall. You saw through my refusal 5 years ago. But you did not understand it. You thought I refused your hand. In truth, I refused the cage you had built around it. I chose the schoolhouse because there, at least, the debts are honest and the labor is my own. I would rather manage a drafty room with a clear ledger than a palace built on the silence of its mistress." The troubled father looked down at the cold toast. A flicker of a smile, sad and self-deprecating, touched his lips. "And now, you have saved the only thing of value I have left. You have managed my household better in 10 hours than I have in 10 years. How do I balance that debt, Jane? How do I look at the woman who refused me and see anything other than the savior of my house?" Jane set her teacup down. The sound was sharp and final. She leveled a gaze at him entirely devoid of warmth. She looked at him with the expectation of a teacher waiting for a student to solve a difficult equation. "You do not balance it with gratitude, Arthur," she advised. "Gratitude is a fleeting emotion that requires no labor. You balance it with restitution. You will repair the bridge. You will audit your tenant records. You will become the steward this estate deserves. And you will understand that my presence here is not an act of forgiveness. It is an act of necessity. I am here for Julian, not for the man who fathered him." She stood then, her spine a perfectly vertical line against the dawn. She hardly seemed like someone who had spent the night in a kitchen. She looked like a queen who had just finished reviewing the accounts of a fallen kingdom. The Duke watched her, the silver tea tray between them. For the first time, he did not see a difficult woman. He saw the only truth he had ever encountered. "The night is over," Jane announced. Her gaze shifted back to Julian as the boy began to stir. "The management of the fever begins now. A matter of action, Arthur. Always a matter of action." The morning light did not arrive at Aristhall with the grace of a benediction. It arrived with the cold, clinical clarity of a balance sheet. Jane Ellingham sat at the scarred oak table in the kitchen, the stone mortar and pestle resting beside a stack of bound papers she had discovered in a cupboard near the pantry. This was the household logbook, a thick volume of vellum and ink that should have been the heart of the estate's domestic order. Instead, it was a testament to 5 years of neglect. Jane turned the pages with a rhythmic flick of her wrist, her eyes scanning the columns of figures with the speed of a practiced auditor. She required no tutor to tell her that the numbers were screaming. There were gaps in the procurement of coal, unexplained deficits in the grain stores, and a list of servants' wages that had not been adjusted in years. The Aristhall logbook was not a record of groceries. It was a map of a dying dynasty, a paper trail of a steward that had stopped looking at his own foundation. Jane dipped her pen into the inkpot, her fingers steady despite the 20 hours she had spent without sleep. She began to make corrections in the margins, her handwriting a sharp, elegant contrast to the sloppy scrawl of the former clerk. She noted the price of flour from the local mill and compared it to the inflated rate the Duke had been paying to a middleman in London. It was a matter of arithmetic, not of malice. Every penny lost to mismanagement was a penny taken from the maintenance of the bridge where Julian Vane had almost died. Jane's jaw tightened as she calculated the cumulative loss. The heavy door to the kitchen swung open and the air in the room shifted. Lady Sophia Thorne swept into the room, her silk gown of lilac damask rustling against the rough flagstones like a swarm of angry hornets. She smelled of expensive lavender water and cloying French perfume, scents that had no place among the medicinal bitterness of willow bark and the honest smell of rising dough. Sophia ignored the servants, who immediately lowered their heads in submission. She looked only at the table where the heir to the duchy lay wrapped in flannels, and then at the woman who sat beside him like a stone sentinel. "Good heavens," Lady Sophia Thorne said, her voice a carefully constructed trill of artificial concern. "Is this where the child has been kept? In a kitchen? Among the flour and the grease? It is a wonder the poor boy has not succumbed to an infection already. Martha, why was he not moved to the Blue Suite hours ago?" The teacher remained seated. She kept her pen raised. She simply waited for the silence to become a weight that Sophia could no longer carry. When she finally looked up, her gaze was as cool as a frozen lake. "The boy is here, Lady Sophia, because the kitchen provides a consistent regulation of caloric that the drafty Blue Suite cannot maintain. His core temperature is currently stable. Moving him would cause a sudden drop in that stability, which would likely trigger the lung congestion we are currently preventing. It is a requirement of physical stability, not of decor." Sophia's face flushed a dangerous pink. She approached the table, her gloved hand reaching out as if to touch Julian's forehead. "You speak of him as if he were a laboratory specimen. Miss Ellingham, a child needs his family, not a lecture on heat regulation. I shall sit with him now. You may go and attend to your ledgers." Jane's hand moved with a sudden, decisive speed. She refrained from striking, but she placed the heavy logbook directly in the path of Sophia's reach. The thud of the vellum against the wood was like a closing door. "You will not touch him. Lady Sophia, your gloves are treated with a lead-based whitener that is toxic if inhaled by a child in respiratory distress. Furthermore, your presence is causing a rise in the ambient noise level, which is increasing the boy's heart rate. I have audited his pulse every 15 minutes. Since you entered this room, it has risen significantly. If you truly care for the Vane legacy, you will retire to the morning room and allow the work of recovery to continue in silence." The scullery maids gasped. No one spoke to Lady Sophia Thorne in such a manner. Sophia drew herself up, her eyes flashing with aristocratic pride. "You forget your place, Jane. You are here as a guest of convenience, a temporary necessity, because you happen to be at the riverbank. Do not mistake the Duke's sudden state of shock for a permanent elevation of your status. You are a woman who works for a pittance in a schoolhouse. You are a common drudge, and you will find that Aristhall has a very short memory for drudges." Jane Ellingham stood then, her spine a perfectly vertical line that seemed to dwarf Sophia's manicured elegance. She raised no shout, she shed no tears. She simply looked at the logbook she had just corrected. "A drudge, Lady Sophia, is the only reason this household still has enough coal to keep the fires burning this morning. While you were selecting the color of your silk, I was auditing the accounts of this estate. I have found 3 separate instances of fraud in the procurement of the kitchen supplies, fraud that has cost the Duke nearly £40 in the last quarter alone. Knowledge is a weapon, and you appear to be completely unarmed." Sophia Thorne opened her mouth to deliver a rebuttal, but the words died in her throat as she caught sight of a shadow in the doorway. Arthur Vane stood there, his shoulder leaning against the stone frame. He had been there for several minutes, silent and unobserved. His grey eyes were not on the woman who shared his rank. They were fixed on the schoolmistress with the ink-stained fingers. He watched the way Jane stood her ground, her dignity not a mask she wore, but a fundamental part of her soul. "Arthur," Sophia cried, her voice shifting back to its melodic, fragile tone. "Thank goodness you are here. This woman is being quite impossible. She refuses to allow me near Julian, and she is speaking of ledgers and flour prices as if she were a common clerk. Surely you can see that she is overwhelmed." The Duke stayed rooted to the spot. He provided no arm to Sophia or a word of comfort. He looked at Jane. Seeing the way she had already begun to turn back to her work, the logbook open and the pen ready, she sought no protection from him. She craved no approval. She was simply continuing the labor of restoration, one entry at a time. "She is not overwhelmed, Sophia," Arthur said, his voice level and heavy with a new authority. "She is the only person in this room who appears to know exactly what she is doing. If she tells you that your gloves are toxic, then you will remove them, or you will remove yourself. The schoolmistress has already proven that her knowledge of this estate exceeds my own. I suggest you do not test the limits of her patience." Lady Sophia Thorne stood frozen. The betrayal of her rank by the man she intended to marry was a shock she could not process. Without another word, she gathered her skirts and fled the kitchen, the rustle of her silks sounding like a retreat. Arthur Vane walked to the table and looked down at the logbook. He saw the sharp, clear corrections Jane had made, the meticulous audits of his own failures. "You found the leaks in the coal budget," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper as he traced a finger over a column Jane had crossed out. "It was not a difficult discovery, Arthur," Jane replied, keeping her gaze on the pages. The numbers were inconsistent with the volume of the fireplaces in the main hall. "You have been cheated by your purveyor for 3 years. I have already drafted a letter to the mill demanding a refund for the overages on the flour. You will sign it when your hand is steady enough." She closed the logbook with a final, physical thud that echoed through the stone kitchen. "Now, the Duke's son requires his medicine. A requirement of precise chemistry, Arthur, not of conversation." 2 hours later, Jane Ellingham found herself standing at the base of the servants' stairs. She carried a small tray with Julian's second dose of the willow bark tincture. The house was waking up now, the sounds of distant bells and rhythmic thumping of carpets providing a chaotic symphony of domestic life. Jane paused, her hand resting on the iron rail. The cold of the stone seeped through her palm, a reminder of the physical reality beneath the gilded surfaces of the duchy. She heard voices above her, the sharp, cutting tones of Lady Sophia Thorne. Jane never intended to eavesdrop, but the narrow stairwell carried the words down to her with clarity. "I do not care what the Duke says," Sophia's voice hissed. "That woman is a parasite. She is utilizing a tragic accident to insert herself into a position of influence she has no right to occupy. A schoolmistress from Oakhaven. To have her auditing the books is a slap in the face to every noble house in this county. She is a commoner with the delusions of a steward, and I want her out of this house." Jane stood perfectly still. Her spine remained as straight as a ledger line. To Sophia, Jane was a threat not because of her beauty, but because of her competence. Jane looked down at the tincture on her tray. It was a simple mixture of bark and water, yet it held more power than all of Sophia's lilac silk. Lady Sophia Thorne appeared at the top of the stairs, her silhouette blocking the light. She stopped when she saw Jane standing in the shadows below. "Eavesdropping now, Miss Ellingham," Sophia said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. I suppose it is a habit one picks up in the village when one has no social standing of one's own. Jane Ellingham began to climb the stairs, her pace rhythmic and measured. She maintained a steady pace. When she reached the landing, she stood inches from the other woman, her gaze steady. I was not eavesdropping, Lady Sophia. I was simply waiting for the path to be cleared of unnecessary obstructions, Jane clarified, keeping her volume low. You speak of my background as if it were a deficit, but my years in the schoolhouse have taught me one thing. The world does not run on titles. It runs on the labor of those you consider invisible. You call me a parasite, yet you cannot dress yourself without a maid or justify your existence without a husband's name. I, however, can save a life and audit a kingdom. Sophia's hand flew up, but she froze. From the shadows of the gallery above, the Duke of Aristhall stepped into the light. He had heard every word. He looked at Sophia Thorne as if he were looking at a decorative object that had suddenly revealed itself to be hollow. Then, his gaze shifted to Jane. He saw the tray in her hands and the unwavering pride in the set of her shoulders. He realized then that the woman he had once dismissed was the only thing standing between his house and ruin. Arthur Vane walked past Sophia as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong room. He reached Jane and placed a hand lightly on her arm, a gesture of respect that was more profound than any bow. "The medicine, Jane?" he asked, his voice soft. "It is time for the second dose." Arthur, Jane replied. "A matter of timing. Always a matter of timing." The Duke stood aside, allowing the schoolmistress to lead the way back to the boy. As Jane walked past, her spine perfectly straight, she forged ahead without turning around. She had a boy to save and a house to audit. The ledger was finally being balanced, and for the first time in 5 years, Jane Ellingham was the one holding the pen. She returned to the kitchen table where Julian lay, the sound of the door closing behind her, a final, rhythmic period at the end of the morning's long and difficult sentence. The nursery at Aristhall Hall was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a theatre of shadows and stagnant air. For 14 days, the house had lived in a fragile state of hope, the Oakhaven River seemingly a conquered enemy, as Julian Vane showed signs of a rallying spirit. He had taken broth and whispered of the horses, but on the 14th night, the silence of the recovery was shattered by the rhythmic, shallow gasping of a system in sudden collapse. The relapse came without warning, a violent surge of internal heat that transformed the boys' room back into a fortress under siege. The atmosphere grew thick with the scent of burning beeswax and the metallic tang of a body in distress. Julian Vane lay at the center of the vast expanse of white linen, his small frame appearing fragile and translucent against the backdrop of his father's ancestral grandeur. His skin was no longer the soft cream of the dawn watch. It had transformed into a flushed, angry parchment, the heat radiating from his brow in dry, pulsing waves. Jane Ellingham stood at the bedside, her fingers pressed against the boy's carotid artery, counting the rapid, thready beats against the mechanical ticking of the mahogany clock on the mantelpiece. She refused to cast a glance toward the father. Her gaze avoided the thick oak door completely. She remained a fixed point of observation, her mind calculating the trajectory of the fever with the cold, intellectual rigor of an auditor facing a bankruptcy. Dr. Alistair Sterling stood by the window, his shadow looming large and distorted against the patterned wallpaper. He was a man of high standing and even higher collars, his face a map of professional arrogance. Summoned from the city by Lady Sophia Thorne, he had arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, bringing a leather case filled with silver lancets and copper bowls. He spoke in the rhythmic, authoritative tones of an expert that believed the ancient humors of the body could be negotiated with a blade. To this man, the boy was not a biological system in crisis. He was a vessel of excess heat that needed to be drained of its vitality. He looked at the schoolmistress with a disdain that was as sharp as his tools, dismissive of any wisdom that did not come from a university ledger. "The boy is consumed by a sanguineous fire," the physician said, his voice echoing with a hollow performative gravity. "The immersion in the river 2 weeks ago has caused a delayed, violent surge of the vital fluids toward the lungs. We must let 12 ounces of blood immediately to relieve the pressure on the heart. It is the only course sanctioned by the Royal College. Without the lancet, the fever will simply cook the brain within the skull." He reached for his case, the metallic click of the latch sounding like a final judgment in the heavy silence of the nursery. Arthur Vane stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of suppressed indignity. He looked from the physician's silver blade to the woman sitting beside his son. He saw the way Jane's hand remained steady on the boy's pulse, and the way her spine remained as straight as a ledger line against the back of the wooden chair. He was caught between the weight of tradition and the terrifying silent competence of the woman he had once dismissed. He remembered the river, the way she had calculated the ferry angle of the current when others would have simply drowned. He remembered the 14 days of her tireless stewardship. The Duke felt the cold weight of his own ignorance, an owner holding half the county, but knew nothing of the mechanics of a child's breath. Jane acted before the Duke could speak. She kept her focus firmly on Julian's face. The boy has spent the last 14 days recovering from a state of near-total caloric depletion and physical shock, she said, her voice level and devoid of the tremors that usually accompanied a challenge to a man of the physician's rank. His heart is already struggling to maintain the velocity of his blood through a system that has been damaged by extreme cold. To remove 12 ounces of fluid now would not be a cure. It would be an act of physical foreclosure. You would be draining the very medium that carries the heat away from his core. He does not have an excess of blood. He has a deficit of hydration and a failure of thermal regulation. The man from the capital stiffened, his face reddening. And who is this person? A village schoolmistress offering medical opinions to a graduate of Edinburgh. My Lord Duke, I cannot perform my duties while a commoner critiques the fundamental laws of the profession. This is a matter of science, not of household management. He brandished the lancet as if it were a scepter, his authority challenged by a woman with ink-stained fingers and a plain bombazine dress. The schoolmistress is the woman who dragged my son from the Oakhaven current while you were still 50 miles away in a carriage, Arthur Vane said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And she is the woman who has kept him breathing through the night, and every night since. Speak to her with the respect her labor has earned, or you will find yourself back in that carriage before the hour is out. The Duke's gaze was unwavering. He had made his choice, casting aside the safety of professional consensus for the sharp, difficult truth of Jane's logic. Jane completely ignored the Duke's defense. She stood and moved to the nightstand where her stone mortar and pestle sat, the grey granite appearing utilitarian and honest against the polished mahogany. She began to measure out the dried willow bark and the feverfew she had brought from her own modest apothecary. The sound of the stone against the bark was a rhythmic, grounding pulse, a steady, mechanical grind that spoke of discipline over theory. She understood that the salicin in the bark would act as a catalyst to reduce inflammation. While the feverfew stabilized the vessels dilated by the heat, the stone mortar and pestle was not a domestic tool. It was a weapon of restoration. I am preparing a willow bark tincture, Jane stated, her hands moving with meticulous, practiced efficiency. It will be administered in 4 drachm doses every 2 hours. We will use the heated river stones, now cooled to a moderate warmth, to draw the circulation toward the extremities and away from the lungs. We are not going to bleed him. We are going to restore the order of his system through the application of logic and botanical chemistry. She requested no permission. She stated the terms of the boy's survival. Jane worked the pestle with a silent private art of survival, her actions synchronized with the rhythmic pendulum swinging on the wall. She was oblivious to the social crime she was committing by dismissing the prominent physician. To her, there was only the ratio of the uppers, the temperature of the water, and the flickering candle that illuminated the task. She saw the fever as a debt that needed to be paid with precision and patience, not with the reckless expenditure of the boy's remaining strength. The physician watched her for a moment, his indignation clashing with the cold reality of the Duke's stare. He realized then that he was no longer the authority in the room. He was a spectator in a kingdom governed by a woman who valued a balanced ledger over a prestigious title. He gathered his lancets with a series of sharp, metallic clicks. If the boy dies, the responsibility will rest entirely upon this accountant's approach to medicine, he hissed. I shall remain in the guest wing, Duke, should you regain your senses before the end. When the door closed behind the man, The silence that returned was heavy with the weight of the choice Arthur had made. He stood behind Jane as she filtered the dark liquid into a silver cup. He watched her ink-stained fingers, steady and precise, as she cleared a stray leaf from the brew. She never turned her gaze his way. She simply held the cup to Julian's parched lips and began the slow process of administration. "You took a great risk, Arthur," Jane murmured, speaking softly to avoid disturbing the boy. "To dismiss a man of his standing is to invite a social scandal. Lady Sophia Thorne will not forget that her chosen expert was cast out. He will tell the county that you have lost your mind to grief and the influence of a village woman." "The county does not have to live in a house without a son, Jane," the Duke replied. He pulled a chair into the circle of light. "The scandal is a matter of reputation. Julian is a matter of reality. I find that, under your influence, I am beginning to prefer the latter. It is a matter of stewardship, is it not?" The night deepened, the shadows stretching across the floor as the candle burned lower. Jane remained in her position, a silent sentinel of competence. Every 2 hours she administered the tincture. Every 15 minutes she checked the boy's pulse and the temperature of his skin. She did not sleep. She did not allow her hand to touch at the back of the chair. She maintained a posture of unyielding stewardship, her mind an internal logbook, where every shift in the boy's condition was recorded. She was auditing the very life of the Vane heir. Arthur Vane watched her from the shadows. He saw the way she handled his son, not with saccharine sentimentality, but with the profound respect of an architect tending to a crumbling foundation. He saw the weariness in her eyes, and he felt a sharp ache in his chest. It was the ache of a patrician that had lived his life in a gallery of portraits, only to realize he had never once looked at the living truth behind the canvas. "I called you difficult, Jane," Arthur said, the words blinking silentness of the third period watch. 5 years ago, in the garden. "I told my father that you were a difficult girl who didn't understand the honor of the Vane name. I thought your intellect was a defect, a sharp edge that would scratch the polish of my life. I was a fool who mistook a mountain for a stone in my shoe." Jane maintained the rhythm of her work. She was smoothing a cool cloth over Julian's wrists, her movements rhythmic and certain. "You were correct, Arthur. I am difficult. I am difficult because I refuse to be an ornament in a house that is falling apart. I am difficult because I prefer the truth of a ledger to the beauty of a lie. You did not want a wife. You wanted a mirror that would only show you the things you liked about yourself. I was never going to be that mirror. My value was never in my compliance, but in my capability. I see that now," the Duke said, his voice a low, gravelly confession. "The difficulty I despised was actually the very competence I lacked. I was a man of stewardship who didn't know how to steward his own heart. I surrounded myself with people who never asked me to be anything more than a title. You asked me to be an architect of my own life, and I was too small for the task." He walked to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the woods. The pride that had been his armor for 30 years had finally been stripped away. "The fever is breaking, Arthur," Jane noted, her delivery cutting through his reflection with the clinical finality of a closing book. The Duke turned. He saw Jane leaning over Julian, her hand resting on the boy's chest. The angry flush had faded, replaced by a fine sheen of perspiration. The boy's breathing was no longer a jagged struggle. It was a soft, rhythmic rise and fall that spoke of a system returning to its proper orbit. The debt of the river had been paid once more, and the ledger of the night was finally balanced. Jane Ellingham sat back, her shoulders finally dropping an inch as she exhaled a long breath. She shed no tears. She made no move to reach for Arthur's hand. She picked up her stone mortar and pestle and began to clean them with a linen cloth, her movements as methodical as they had been at the start of the vigil. The crisis had passed, and the work of restoration was simply moving into its next phase. She had saved the boy again, using only her mind and her hands. "You should sleep now, Arthur," Jane advised, her gaze fixed on the tools of her trade. "The boy will sleep for the next 6 hours. He is stable. The technical risk has passed. The rest is a matter of time and nutrition. I will notify Mrs. Gable to prepare the necessary broths." "And you, Jane?" Arthur asked. "Will you sleep?" I have a schoolhouse to audit and a garden to tend," Jane replied, her spine straightening once more as she prepared to leave the room. "I do not have the luxury of the Duke's hours. The world does not stop turning because one boy has been saved. It simply continues its counting. She stood and walked toward the door, her heavy wool cloak draped over her arm like a discarded shield. She exited without glancing back at the gentleman who had once refused her mind. She had saved his son, audited his house, and dismantled his pride. As the door clicked shut behind her, the nursery was left in a state of ordered silence. The only sound, the ticking of the mahogany clock and the steady living breath of the heir to Aristhall. The Duke remained by the bed, his hand resting on the spot where Jane had sat, realizing that the woman he had once called difficult was the only architect who could ever hope to rebuild the ruin of his life. He watched the dawn light beginning to touch the window, a cold promise of a new reality. He was no longer just a duke. He was a partner that had finally learned the value of the woman he had lost. The dining room at Aristhall Hall was a cavernous monument to ancient vanity, its walls lined with the oil-painted eyes of ancestors who had spent 3 centuries mistaking luck for merit. Jane Ellingham had returned to the estate at sunset, not as a resident, but as a creditor of the truth. After leaving the nursery at dawn, she had spent the day at her schoolhouse, but she had accepted this final invitation for a formal dinner to settle the social and financial accounts of the house. On this evening, the long mahogany table was spread with a linen cloth so white it appeared clinical under the flicker of 24 beeswax candles. The temperature in the room was precisely 52 degrees, the coldness of the stone floors leaching through the thin rugs. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison and the unspoken, sharp-edged judgment of the county's minor gentry. Jane sat near the foot of the table, her spine a perfectly vertical line of defiance against the padded velvet of her chair. She wore her plain grey bombazine dress, a garment that had been meticulously brushed but remained an affront to the silk and lace that surrounded her. She made no attempt to hide her ink-stained fingers. She held her head high when the neighboring guests looked through her, as if she were a piece of misplaced domestic equipment. Jane sat with the quiet composure of an auditor who had already seen the bottom of every guest's soul and found the accounts lacking. Lady Sophia Thorne sat to the Duke's right, her lilac silk shimmering with a predatory luminescence. She had spent the last hour directing a series of social microaggressions toward the schoolmistress. Sophia spoke of the upcoming London scene and the decline of village morals. She managed the conversation as if it were a tactical maneuver, attempting to isolate Jane within the vacuum of her own commonality. To the gathered guests, Jane was a mystery, a woman who had saved the heir but refused to be a hero, a common teacher found auditing the Duke's private logbooks in the dead of night. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and a deep, ancestral fear of the competence she radiated. Near the sideboard, Mrs. Martha Gable stood with her hands folded, her observant eyes moving between the schoolmistress and the Duke. The wine glass before Lady Sophia was a delicate, fluted vessel of Venetian crystal. She lifted it now, the crimson liquid swirling in a miniature vortex. Sophia looked across the silver epergne and caught Jane's eye. "We are all so profoundly grateful to Miss Ellingham for her assistance during Julian's little accident," Sophia said, her voice carrying a sharp, melodic projection. "It is truly remarkable what a village woman can achieve when she possesses the physical stamina of a laborer. One assumes the schoolhouse provides ample opportunity for such robust exertions. It must be quite a change for her to sit at a table where the silver is not measured in copper pence." Jane remained entirely composed. She ignored the silver. She tuned out the whispers. She waited exactly 3 seconds, allowing the social crime of Sophia's remark to settle. "I did not come to this table to discuss the copper pence of my schoolhouse," Jane countered, maintaining a level cadence. "I came to this house because the infrastructure of the Vane estate was failing its inhabitants. The stamina you find so remarkable, Lady Sophia, is a requirement of survival in a world where roofs leak and bridges crumble. I find it curious that you speak of the silver while the Aristhall logbook indicates that 4/4 of the quarterly budget was lost to a fraud you failed to notice. The Aristhall logbook was not a collection of paper. It was a map of a dying dynasty." The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. Jane continued, her voice gaining a rhythmic, analytical intensity. "Beyond that sum, I discovered a £12 discrepancy in the grain tithes from the East Valley. There was also a recorded £15 for repairs on the tenant cottages that were never actually executed. The stone was never delivered, the mortar was never mixed, and yet the Duke's ledger was bled dry. I found these errors in 3 hours of auditing. You, Lady Sophia, have spent 3 years in the morning room and saw only the quality of the tea. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lady Sophia's hand trembled, the wineglass chiming against the edge of her plate. Jane remained unmoved, her gaze fixed on the Duke at the head of the table. You value the facade of this house, but you have ignored the foundation. You have sat in these chairs while the man who fathered your host's heir ignored the very mechanics of the boy's safety. Competence is not a social rank, Lady Sophia. It is a debt that must be paid in labor, not in lilac silk. Arthur Vane stood then. He bypassed the rehearsed grace of his station. He stood with the sudden, heavy finality of an individual that had reached the end of a long and difficult sentence. He walked the length of the long mahogany table, his boots sounding a rhythmic, echoing pulse against the polished floor. He stopped beside Jane's chair and looked down at her. He saw the ink on her fingers. He saw the grey bombazine. He reached out and placed his hand on the back of her chair, a physical declaration of alignment that froze the blood of every person in the room. The schoolmistress is correct, the master of the house stated, his voice dropping to a register that commanded the shadows of the hall. This household has lived in a state of moral and financial insolvency. I have spent my years in a library of ghosts while my estate bled and my son nearly drowned. Miss Ellingham did not save Julian through a miracle. She saved him through the application of a mind that is more rigorous and more essential to this county than any title I possess. He looked at Lady Sophia Thorne. You call her a drudge, Sophia. I call her the architect of my son's survival, and the only person in this room who has the courage to speak the truth. He turned back to Jane, his posture bowing slightly, a surrender of his own pride. Miss Ellingham has audited my house and found it wanting. She has audited my character and found it deficient. I do not ask for your gratitude, Jane. I do not even ask for your forgiveness. I simply ask that this county understands that you are my equal in every sense that the ledger of life can measure. He lifted his own wine glass. To competence, he said, and to the woman who taught me that a duke without stewardship is merely a man with a very expensive ruin. The dinner ended in a state of ordered silence. Jane Ellingham stood in the great hall as the last carriage lanterns faded. She felt the chill of the evening air through the open door, a scent of damp soil and ancient stone. She experienced no triumph of a social victory. She felt the quiet satisfaction of a job finished. She had balanced the books of Aristhall. She had dismantled the pride of its master and secured the breath of its heir. Her work here was concluded. The following morning, the sun rose over Oakhaven with a cold yellow clarity. Jane walked toward the riverbank, her heavy wool cloak draped over her shoulders. She followed the bend of the water toward the bridge where the rescue had happened. The river was no longer a monster of liquid silt. It was a boundary of slate-grey peace. She stood on the embankment, her boots sinking into the soft mud, and observed the work. A team of stonemasons were there, directed by a man with a leather-bound plan. They were reinforcing the southern embankment with granite blocks, the sound of the hammers against the stone, a steady, mechanical music. Arthur Vane walked toward her, his silhouette sharp against the morning mist. He was dressed for labor, his hands bare and ready for the cold. He stopped beside her, and they both watched the river. They avoided speaking of the dinner. They stood in the shared silence of those who had learned the language of the task. The bridge will be sound by midsummer, Arthur said. The masonry is being set to a depth of 6 feet into the riverbed to withstand the hydraulic pressure of the spring thaw. I have audited the plans using the principles of geometry you mentioned. It turns out that the tension was indeed focused on the wrong pivot point of the arch. I was building for the eye, Jane. Now I am building for the weight. Jane looked at the granite blocks. They were dense, grey stones from the northern quarry, selected for their lack of porosity. She saw the precision of the joints. It was the physical manifestation of the restitution she had demanded. The Duke had stopped being a portrait. He had started being a steward. She adjusted the collar of her cloak. A matter of action, Arthur, she said. The bridge is a contract with the safety of those who cross it. I am glad you have finally signed it. They walked together along the bank. Arthur stopped near a fallen willow. Jane, I have spent 5 years believing that my life was a collection of things I owned. I thought that by offering you Aristhall, I was offering you the world. I see now that I was offering you a debt. I want to build a different world now. I want the schoolhouse to be the center of this estate, not the ballroom. And I want you to manage the transition, not as a wife, but as a partner in the labor. Jane Ellingham looked at him. She saw the honesty in his eyes and the strength in his straight spine. He was offering her a kingdom of responsibility, a partnership of the mind. She responded without a smile. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, a new ledger with clean pages. I have already made the first entry, Arthur, Jane said. The schoolhouse requires 3 new windows and a fireplace that doesn't smoke. The cost will be £12, 6 shillings, and I expect the work to be audited by the end of the month. The Duke of Aristhall smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. I shall prepare the payment immediately, Miss Ellingham, and I shall oversee the installation myself. It is, after all, a matter of management. They turned back toward the village, moving through the morning light. The river moved beside them, a steady force that had once tried to destroy them and had ended by saving them both. The debt of the past was settled, and the ledger of their lives was in perfect balance. The door of the schoolhouse clicked shut, leaving the world in a state of ordered silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the rhythmic hope of a land truly seen.